Hello, this is Russell from Russell Tracy Photography, and today I want to do a quick video on the camera settings that I use for sports photography. Now, before I get into this video, a quick disclaimer: these are not the end-all be-all settings for sports photography. These are the settings that I find that work for me in the venues that I shoot at. So, take these settings, use them as a guideline, but don't say this is what I have to shoot at. Now, getting into the settings that I use, if you watched my basic sports equipment video, I talked about two things. It was autofocus continuous and frames per second. So for autofocus continuous, I always use that. And as far as the mode, I use either single point or dynamic 25, depending on the camera that I'm using. I would avoid using the 3D tracking and the auto modes and stuff like that. I just haven't found them to be very accurate and very good for most sports. With your frame rate, you want to. I prefer to shoot as fast a frame rate as possible. Now, when I shoot 10 frames per second, I'm not holding the shutter down for like 10 seconds. That's just ridiculous. I do quick bursts, just to capture a sequence of action. So like a receiver going up for a ball, quick burst of him going up, catching the ball, and coming back down. And then when you go and look at the photos afterwards, you have that full sequence. You can pick where the peak of the action was and pick the best of the best photo. Now, before we get into the actual settings, shutter speed and whatnot, I always shoot manual or I shoot shutter priority. The automatic modes are going to hold you back. If it's constant light, like during the day or at night or indoors, I shoot manual. If it's changing light, like an evening game where the sun's setting or the sun's going in and out of the clouds, I'll use shutter priority. Now, I don't always use shutter priority for changing light. A lot of times I'll use manual, but I'll set an auto ISO, just so I don't have to worry about, it just got a little darker, it just got a little bit lighter. Now, as far as the settings go, I find that 1/1000th will freeze action. That's kind of the base that you need for most sports to freeze action is 1/1000th of a second. And what I mean by freezing action is not only just like the head and the body, but the feet and hands. So if you look in this, feet are frozen, hands are frozen, the ball's frozen. This was shot at 1/1250th of a second. And that's what you want to get. Unless you're trying to go for a creative shot, which I'm not going to be talking about. Like creative shots like panning shots and stuff like that. This is the freeze action to get the best possible just straight action shot that you can get. Now, as far as aperture goes, I typically stay in the f2.8 to f4 range. What this does for me is it still allows, because it's wide, even at f4, it's wide enough to let in a good bit of light into the camera, but it's got a shallow enough depth of field that I can still blow out the background and get good background separation. Especially if you watch my background video, especially if I'm shooting somewhere that doesn't have the greatest backgrounds. Now, when it comes to ISO, I don't really concern myself with the ISO as much as shutter and aperture. And the reason behind that is you want to get a perfect exposure. Now, this goes with any type of photography. If you're shooting something that has high ISO and you perfectly expose it, that image will look a lot better and a lot cleaner. And what I mean by cleaner is the noise will look cleaner than if you take a photo, the same photo, but it's underexposed, and you try to recover it in post. All recovering the shadows and stuff in post is going to do is it's going to make the noise and the grain stand out more. And that's why I'm not really concerned with high ISO. Now we're going to go through a couple of these photos. What I was saying about perfectly frozen. This photo, this was 1/1250th at f3.2. Now, if you look at the bat and the ball here, there's still motion blur in the bat and the ball, but that's just one of the things where they are moving a lot faster than the player. It's going to take a super high frame rate or super high shutter speed to actually freeze a 90 mile an hour fastball. It's not going to really happen at 1/1000th of a second, but that's not that big of a deal in my opinion, because the ball is moving. Now, yes, you can argue that the hands and feet are moving, but you don't want to see motion blur in hands and feet. Same thing here. This was shot at 1/2000th, so this was even faster. And you can see, again, he's perfectly sharp, but the ball and the end of the bat they have some motion blur. Now, I just said that 1/1000th of a second will freeze action. Now, depending on where I'm shooting, like if it's a night game or if it's an indoor game, I will shoot as low as 1/500th of a second. Now, with 1/500th of a second, you're going to be starting to get a lot of motion blur in the hands and feet. You can see here, there's blur, motion blur in the feet here. There's a little bit in the net, and in the hair. That's going to happen at slower shutter speeds. Now, 1/500th is the lowest that I like to go. I have shot at 1/400th, and the results were usable, but they were not nearly as good as I would have liked. That was a really, really dark, bad high school field. Now, this was a night game, and you can see here this was 1/500th, f2.8, ISO 1600. Face and body are frozen, but there's still, like I said, there's that motion blur in the hands, the feet, the net. It's not that big of a deal. As long as you pan with the players accurately, there'll be less motion blur. Now, this was an indoor game. Again, face and body are frozen. The hands and the feet have a little bit of motion blur in them. But again, this was shot at 1/500th at f3.5, ISO 3200. But there's, again, there's good exposure, good action. Now, if you're shooting indoors, one of the things that you can do is, depending on the school that you're at and the team and the policies, is you can use strobes. And using strobes, now this we shot at 1/250th, because that is the sync speed of the camera that I was using. If you go faster than the sync speed, you're going to start getting the black bar. But what strobing a gem will do is the flash is actually what's freezing the action. When the flash fires for just that millisecond, that's whatever the camera sees when the flash goes off. That's what it captures, even at 1/250th. That's why you can see here everything is just perfectly frozen. The hands, the face, the ball, everything is just spot on, perfectly frozen. Now, the downside to strobes is a lot of times it's difficult to place them where they look good. So unless you can get high into the high above the court, you're going to start getting a lot of harsh shadows and stuff like that. It's just one of those things that you have to be aware of if you're going to strobe indoors. Not going to get into that in this video. It's just something that you need to be aware of. So that's pretty much all my tips when it comes to settings. Now, just to recap, shoot autofocus continuous. When you're shooting autofocus continuous, I avoid the 3D tracking in the auto modes. Frames per second, shoot as fast frames per second as you can, but shoot in quick bursts. You don't need to hold the shutter release down for 5, 10, 15 seconds. You're just wasting your time then. For shutter speed, 1/1000th of a second will freeze the majority of action out there. 1/500th is the lowest that I'll go for nights and indoors and stuff like that. Aperture, I shoot 2.8 to f4 to keep enough light coming in to get a good exposure, but still blow out the background. ISO, set your ISO to get a perfect exposure. That's, like I said before, I'm going to hammer this again. Perfect exposure is key. You don't want to have to go in and recover shadows on a high ISO image. And again, shoot in manual. If you have any comments, questions, anything like that, go ahead and leave a comment below. My contact information's in the description if you want to send me a message that way. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. This is Russell from Russell Tracy Photography. Have a good day.